From Las Vegas, Nevada, the entertainment capital of the world, I'm David Gavri, and this is the Vegas Faces podcast, where we talk with Las Vegas locals about what it's really like to live in the City of Lights. Whether you're living in Vegas, moving to Vegas, or just visiting Vegas and looking for new adventures, together let's discover the hidden gems that make Sin City the most visited place on earth. Hey guys, welcome back to Vegas Faces, where we go behind the scenes with the people who make Las Vegas the most visited city on the planet. I'm your host, David Gavri. My family and I live in Las Vegas, and we love to share what it's like to live here in the entertainment capital. This week's topic is Sammy Davis Jr. and how his life was intertwined with Vegas history. Rick Porello is here to tell us what it was like to be the 19-year-old drummer for Sammy Davis Jr. Rick has written 6 books, some of them became movies, and his latest memoir, titled Just Play Like You Do in the Basement, goes into what it was like to be the drummer for Sammy Davis Jr. and crazy stories about the Mafia. Rick autographed some books for us. Stay tuned on how to get a copy. Let's get into it. Rick, thank you for being one of the Vegas Faces, and thank you for sending us your latest book. I really enjoyed it. You seriously wrote a page turner. And even though this is an era that was way before I was born, it was still like very, very fascinating to me. I couldn't put it down. So thank you again. And I want to start by just getting into the idea of how you first came about with this book at the age of 21. And it kind of started like your entire writing career. As you were researching for it, you went down this other road, wrote 5 other books, and then it all came full circle with your book today. So I'd love to start by getting into that.
Well, thanks, Dave. It's good to be here. And, I started writing at 21, but that seed to write a book got planted really when I was probably 10 or 12 years old, when I kind of heard tell that my grandfather and 3 of my uncles had been murdered during Prohibition. Now we're talking about the early 70s, mid 70s, when I'm hearing a little bit about this. It wasn't something that my father, and I'm talking about my paternal grandfather, it wasn't something that my father talked about. I just happened to hear a little bit. And then a few years later, I found a book on my father's bookshelf. It was called The Mobs and the Mafia by Hank Messick. And I was flipping through it, and there was one page about the Porello Mafia family from Cleveland. And that really kind of piqued my interest even more. And that seed, stayed there until I came off the road after 2.5 years with Sammy Davis Jr. as his drummer. And then that's really when I started my research in earnest for that first book.
The way that the book takes a turn and how it intertwines the Mafia with the performance. I mean, we're talking like the age of Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack, and how pre-Prohibition, how jazz music was like this seedy underground, like risque kind of, it was, I don't know. To me, it seems like the same as like when people talk about rock music in the 70s being like the devil's music. I guess jazz was kind of like that for like the Roaring 20s all the way post Prohibition. So it's really fascinating how like it was, just the Mafia went from these underground clubs to now it's all mainstream, and they got their hand in all these performers and shows and club runners and everything like that. So where your book takes place, it's a really fascinating era of how all of that just played out. And I have to imagine something like that with your family history was that something that was talked about a lot? Was that something that they kind of shielded you from? Like your parents maybe didn't want you to know too much about, you kind of had to learn as you were preparing for the book later in life?
That's exactly it, David. I had to learn as I was preparing. Well, I wasn't really preparing to write the book yet. I was interested in learning why my grandfather and 3 great uncles had been killed. What was it about? What was the larger story? So, I started at the public library, the wonderful public library, in the newspaper archives, and started flipping through. Back then, this is way before they had newspaper archives online. And I just started with the date of my grandfather's murder. It was in 1932 in February. And I didn't know if it was even going to be reported or if it would be, on page 2 or page 3, a small article, medium-sized article. Well, I was pretty much astounded to find that it was front page, above the fold, major newspaper headline. My grandfather Raymond was killed with one of his six brothers and their bodyguard, and that just that story itself, um, because it's blood, it's a blood history, and nobody really talked about it. I don't think really many people knew a whole lot about it, because now we're talking about 1983, 1984, where I'm researching this, and so it was sort of it became a snowball going downhill, because I'd read the one article, and then I'd get another couple of dates from that one. Then I'd look up some more, and as I was rolling along with all this story, I realized that what I was dealing with was the beginning of the Mafia, the story of the beginning of the Mafia in Cleveland, in Northeast Ohio. And after, I don't know, it might have been 6 months or so, I thought, this really needs to be a book. I'd never aspired to writing before. I'd never written a book before. Never thought about writing a book, except for my time on the road with Sammy Davis Jr., because somebody had mentioned you should write a book about that, and I did start putting together some notes and outlines. I had a lot of pictures that I took, because I was a bit of a shutterbug, but this really pulled me in, because it was sort of a mystery. It was family. It was a mystery, and I decided to write that book first, The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia, which would take me 6 years to finish. Another 3 years kind of overlap with some writing and trying to get published, and that wound up being my first book. And that's what it was, about the beginning of traditional organized crime in Cleveland. The Pirellos, the Leonardos, the so-called sugar war, control over corn sugar, which was very, very profitable during Prohibition, and was a ingredient in corn whiskey. So that's kind of how it all started. The other thing was, Sammy Davis Jr. sat in a box for, I don't know, 3 or 4 decades before I finally, 3 or 4 years ago, got back to it, and finally completed it, and it was released about a month ago.
Yeah, I feel like that was like the order of how it was all supposed to happen, just because that era itself, like the mob was part of it. In your book, you mentioned how Sammy Davis Jr. would just take loans from these mafia guys who would, in exchange, for a percentage of his performance money. But talking about how Sammy Davis Jr. just wanted to walk around and throw money around like Sinatra, so he was
Right.
constantly asking these mafia loan sharks to just loan him 100 grand at a time. And okay, yeah, that's fine, Sammy. You can have this cash, but just give it back to us after your next show, whatever. But like, I don't think in order to write this book accurately, it makes sense that you had to get the mafia background first. And the fact that your family had such close ties with that is so wild and crazy and interesting and fascinating that it just seems like it all happened and unfolded the way it was supposed to happen. What still like fascinates me is like nobody in your family was like willing to talk about it, like sit down and tell you about it. Like you had to go to the library. Like, was there like a distant family member who could kind of, you know what I mean? Like, was it very like hush hush? Like nobody, it's just like nobody talks about it. So therefore you can't use them as a resource. Like what part was that like, being that it was so
Yeah,
close in the family?
it was so long ago. I mean, my father was only, I think, 5 years old when his father, my grandfather, was killed. So he didn't know a whole lot. But interestingly, in later years, he was a jazz drummer, a good drummer, small group drummer here in Cleveland. He also got his barber's license, but he got a position as an officer with the musicians union. Now this was during the mid '60s and going into most of the '70s, and he was an officer. He was the head business agent, and back then there was a lot of organized crime influence in the labor unions. Of course, we've probably all heard about the influence in the Teamsters. The musicians union was small compared to that. There wasn't a whole lot of crime influence. My father, because of his name, because of his blood history, I guess, and his personality, he was sort of on the fringes, and he was friendly with some of the old timers in Cleveland here, like Frank Brancato and Angelo Leonardo, who would factor in significantly into mob history in the '70s and '80s, including in Las Vegas with the Skim cases and all that. He was acquainted with Joe Augusto, who was another figure involved in the Skim and you'll probably, I'm guessing you'll want to talk more about that. But it was something that my father did not want me to get into. He wasn't really thrilled when I told him I wanted to research and write a book about this. So, but I did. I kept researching. I was bringing photocopies of newspaper articles home. We have great resources here in the Cleveland area, Cuyahoga County. There's photo archives, great collections, and I was bringing home copies of photographs. And he was helping me with some of them. You know, this guy is your Uncle Rosario. This is this guy, and here's what I remember about this. And he did, even though he was only 5 or 6 years old, he did remember some pretty traumatic things about when his father was killed. So it was sort of there was a little bit of regret, you might say, that I had in bringing this out. But I wanted to understand the whole story, and it's a fascinating. It really is a fascinating story. And yeah, as you pointed out, it plays into my brother getting involved as a drummer in Las Vegas and with Sammy Davis Jr. and then me following in his musical footsteps at least for a few years.
Yeah, and like you said, your dad was like the head of this music union, which the mafia tried to control almost all of the unions. I mean, everyone remembers like the movie The Irishman with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union. That was a big one, but there was also other unions too, and one of them being the Musicians Union, where you get to basically be in charge of booking the shows and the club owners and all that kind of stuff. What was crazy to me in your book is that your dad ends up meeting the guy who was suspected of murdering your grandfather. But because of that working relationship, they had to basically, your dad had to put it past him and just say, hey, I'm not taking it personally. Let's handle business. Like, did he ever talk about that? Like, maybe not during your childhood, but maybe as an adult, you researching for this book, did your dad talk about that? Like, he
He
didn't
did
want, he
talk
didn't vow
specific.
for revenge or anything like that.
No, he wasn't. There was at one point, I think, when he was maybe in his 40s. I don't know. This is uh, stories he relayed with not a whole lot of detail, but that he wanted to get more involved with these guys, but they did not want him. They wanted him where he was as an upcoming drummer, and then eventually becoming an officer. He wasn't in charge of the union. That was the president, but he was assistant to the president, which is basically the head business agent. And I think he understood. And there's that line from the Godfather movie. It's business. It's not personal. It's business. And I think my father understood the organization, and Frank Brancato really became. And that's who we're talking about. Frank Brancato became really a friend to him. But my father really didn't get involved. Um, which was smart of him. He liked playing drums. He was a barber, and then he was an officer with the Musicians Union. He loved meeting the celebrities and the different bands that came in. He'd be backstage and if or maybe meeting them at the airport if they needed anything or troubleshooting any problems they had. That was his. That was really his world. Um, so the organized crime thing, the mob thing, it was just sort of on the fringe. Had he got more involved, and I'm glad he didn't, he might have wound up dead or in prison, like a lot of these guys during the 70s and 80s in Cleveland were destined to.
You mentioned the skimming operation. I feel like a lot of people don't know that, but that's a huge part of Vegas mafia history. It was kind of portrayed and depicted in the movie Casino, but even
Yeah.
still, it was kind of a small part of that. I mean, that was such a crazy movie. A big part of that was Tony Spilotro, which, if you have any information on that character, I'd love to go into him too, the guy that Joe Pesci plays. But the skimming operation, to my knowledge, is how the mafia ended up getting busted, and that was kind of their downfall. But they hid it for years, and that was to my understanding, just taking money off the top. Like they had people counting the money that was going through the casino on a daily basis, and those money counters would end up taking thousands of dollars cash, untaxed, undocumented, and then just it would disappear and go straight into the mafia. But I'd love to know your take on that and how it kind of helped build Las Vegas in a way.
Yeah, well, I mean, you summarize it very well there, what the operation was, and of course, I didn't have direct knowledge of this. With this knowledge would come during research for my first book and then my subsequent books. But you hit it right there. But what set that up was the influence that organized crime had in Las Vegas, starting in the beginning, like when the strip on the strip in the 1940s and going into the 50s, and also going back to what you said about the unions. The organized crime needed to have friends in important places. It wasn't just labor unions. It could be police departments. It could be corrupt political figures. Anyone who could kind of help them in some way, or perhaps steer interference to another direction. So they always tried to have friends in these positions of authority, and they'd even groom them. And maybe that's sort of a little bit what happened with my father. But so Cleveland was involved as well as other organized crime families, certainly. Chicago, and in the beginning of Las Vegas, and as it started to take off, and I think we know the story. Most people know the story of the Flamingo and Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky and all that money that was starting off. And when they realized that there would be these millions and millions of dollars flowing through these casinos, of course, what are these mobsters going to do? They're going to try and take as much as they can. So they would engineer someone friendly, maybe to be in charge or in a position of authority. They'd call him a straw man. A straw man is a front man, a person who had a clean criminal slate, so they could pass muster with the licensing restrictions and all that. And then they had other inside people, other friendly people, and you described it well. As money came in from the tables and from the machines to the count rooms, as it was being unloaded, but before it was officially documented, they'd siphon off 10, 20, 30, $50,000, and that was going to Chicago, the Chicago mob family, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Kansas City, by couriers who would actually carry satchels or suitcases of cash back to their home cities. And that's also portrayed in the movie Casino. You see all those old time guys sitting around the table in the back of this Italian import store. Vinnie Vella, who I knew from To Kill the Irishman, was one of the characters. But those guys are portraying the bosses of these Midwest mafia families, and that's really what was going on. And until the FBI got involved, and Las Vegas Metro Intelligence and all of their law enforcement partners started, with wiretaps and getting all of this evidence together, so they could start indicting some of these figures that were stealing money from the casinos.
I mean, how do they even get caught? Is it just they're looking at other casinos that are not mafia run and looking at their financials and comparing? Like, how do you even catch something like that other than maybe, I don't know, go into it, Rick, if you happen to know.
Yeah, well, I didn't really study that in depth, but I think wiretaps had a lot to do with it. The feds were coming out with more tools in their basket, so to speak, and the federal anti-racketeering laws were coming around in the 60s, and then by the time the 70s came around, they were getting better at using these tools, and also interagency cooperation. Local agencies, state agencies, federal agencies. A lot of these cases, they weren't just the FBI. There were local police departments. There were state agencies, other federal agencies, the IRS, that were, pooling their resources. And there were strike forces the federal government put together in a lot of the major cities. And all of this was coming together. And then you also had, which was really an essential part of the whole package for these prosecutions, were turncoats, or federal cooperating witnesses. I mentioned one of them was Joe Augusto, who was over at the Tropicana with that big show. I think he was the entertainment director, the Folie Bergère, which I think ran big Parisian style production show that ran for some, I don't know, 40 years or so. He was over there, and he was sort of a Kansas City mob's inside man over there. So they were able to get him to cooperate, and I think he testified, and some of the Kansas City mobsters were were convicted during the first of the two big casino skimming trials that they dubbed Strawman.
Wow.
Strawman. There was Strawman 1, and then later Strawman 2. And I think Augusto testified for Strawman 1, and then he had a heart attack and died. Um, and then later they developed other key cooperating witnesses. I speak of the federal government, the FBI in particular, which included here from Cleveland, Angelo Leonardo, who started when he was 17 or 18 years old, which I talk about in my first book, avenging his father's murder that occurred in 1927 and was the start of what I mentioned, the Sugar War, a series of battles largely between the Perello brothers, my grandfather and his brothers, and the four Leonardo brothers, which was Angelo's father and three uncles. And the Sugar War resulted in the murders of numerous members of those families. But Angelo got his start and then rose through the ranks to become one-time acting boss of the Cleveland mob. So when he flipped after the murder of Danny Green, which is another subject that I'm not sure if you even want to get into that, Irish-American figure here in Cleveland. He was called the Irishman, not to be confused with Martin Scorsese's movie. But after that, the Cleveland mob, after that murder, there were prosecutions, and the Cleveland mob tried to regroup. They got into drug racketeering, and that's how Angelo Leonardo got in trouble. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, and after a few months, I don't know, 6 months or so, he flipped. And at the time, that was 1983, he was the highest ranking member of the American Mafia to flip, as they say, and become a federal cooperating witness. And he, along with who was another one, Jimmy the Weasel Frediano out in Los Angeles, who had been an FBI informant. They were key witnesses in the Strawman 2 trial, and also later in the so-called commission trial later in the 80s when the bosses of the the 5 New York families were put on trial, which was huge because the bosses were typically, through all those decades, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they were insulated. They were buffered. And there's another scene in The Godfather about the buffers that the family had so that they couldn't get to the boss. So these guys testified, Leonardo, and they were very important to the federal government's case against the mob. So they had a lot of success during the late 70s in through the early and mid and later 80s.
Wow. Rick, can I ask, you may not have an answer for this, but I'm curious because I hear this a lot living in Vegas. People always say that Vegas was better when the mob ran it. Like that's like a very common saying out here. Like why do like someone of my generation and younger generation, they probably don't understand why would people even say that? Why, like, where does that come from?
Yeah. Well, I've made a rather pleasant sideline doing presentations, almost always in Cleveland, Northeast Ohio. Very rarely travel, but I get at the end of the presentation, which are usually based on my books about organized crime history in Northeast Ohio. We do a Q&A, and sometimes that question comes up, and I think people feel that way because the neighborhoods where some of the like higher ranking mobsters, the lieutenants and the underboss, the boss, where they lived were typically nicer neighborhoods. There wasn't a lot of crime because they kind of kept a lid on those things. You didn't go into those neighborhoods and mess around. I'm talking about your general run of the mill street criminal. I think that was part of it. The other part is back then you knew who the criminals were. There was an organization, an organized element to organized crime. Even the investigators, law enforcement figures. In fact, Angelo Leonardo, I think, is one of them who said that there was a certain respect that they had for most of them, not all of them, they had for each other. I think the way he described it was almost like they were on opposing sports teams, where you're definitely in conflict and competing against one another, but there's a certain respect about it. I think that was part of it. And then, when the feds and these strike forces and cooperation between the different level agencies, local, state, and federal, when they brought down organized crime in such a dramatic fashion mostly during the 1980s, and really all but crippled. I don't want to say crippled because I think they're still out there. Traditional organized crime. What happened was other organized crime groups sort of filled in, and these other groups were much more violent. I remember when I started into police work in 1986, we were just starting to learn about the involvement of cartels, the drug cartels, who were said to be very violent. If they were, after me, let's say I'm a high-ranking guy and I'm sitting having lunch somewhere, and the mob is after me, they're going to come up. There's going to be one guy who comes up and kills me. The cartel, on the other hand, they might come in with machine guns, and two or three, four innocent people are going to be killed. So I think that sort of that increase in violence and not knowing who the criminals are, and the proliferation of gangs and drugs into the cities, and I think how that took off and created just new problems. Not new, but maybe, I mean, of course, the gangs have been around for a long time, but just a different kind of a problem, maybe harder to get a grasp on. I think might be what some of those folks would say things were better when the mafia is in charge. Now, having been a career law enforcement officer, it's hard for me to agree with something like that, but I understand the perspective of where that comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you say that you think that they're still out there, like, does the mafia ever really just go away, or does it just morph and evolve? And a lot of people think that the corporations are just the new age mafia. Like, does it actually ever go away, or does it just kind of mutate?
Well, I love the word you use, the morph. They evolve, into different criminal activities, more white collar crime, more fraud. But that's not to say that at one time there were some, I don't know, it might have been 22, maybe 2 dozen organized crime families across they call them, a little denigration of the word family there, but that's what they were referred to, in cities across the country. You mentioned a lot of them in the Midwest: Kansas City, Milwaukee, Chicago, of course, the 5 families in New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, um, and all across the country, maybe 2 dozen. That's not to say that they've all survived, you know, but I think there's a certain attachment to that tradition that a lot of people, young men, older men, have in having some connection, some blood connection, some association with that history. You know, so I think even if they're not still around in some of these smaller towns, sitting around a table planning a crime, planning crimes for the day, there's still that element of that history, of that tradition, of of doing what they wanted to do, and trying to make a lot of money by not working too hard. And a lot of people, a lot of young men, that was attractive. Some of these guys were like, when these kids were in their young guys were in their teens, late teens, early 20s, they looked up to these other guys because they're wearing really nice clothes, they're driving nice cars, they're flashing a lot of cash, and they seem to do what they want to do. Like in the movie, was it Goodfellas? Young Henry Hill saying, yeah, they got a parking ticket, and they tore it up and nobody did anything about it. So there's certain opposition to authority that I think was and maybe is attractive still, unfortunately, to a lot of young men who would be much better off, getting an education and doing and pursuing something legal.
Yeah, absolutely. Rick, did you ever get any pushback when writing all of these books? Even for your movies? Like, were there ever anybody that reached out to you that said, "Hey, you better not put that in my book or in your book, or don't you better not put that in the movie"? Like, did you ever experience anything like that? And overall, how did all of this research help you as a writer itself?
Yeah, so my father, like I said, was kind of opposed to me writing the story. So I mean, generally speaking, if you're talking about pushback, it started with him and some of my older relatives. Now that would change over the years, especially with Kill the Irishman, especially when the producer Tommy Reed was successful along with Code Entertainment's producers in getting that movie actually made. I think they were certainly some of the my relatives were, I think, kind of proud of my efforts, and with that first book, they understood the big picture. I mean, I certainly didn't answer all the questions, solve all the mysteries, but they understood what happened to their grandfather, to their uncles. Pushback more along the lines of what you're talking about. Very rarely was there anything. There were certainly no real threats or anything like that. I had more occasional threats at work, as a police officer, certainly than I had as a writer, because the vast majority of what I was writing about was already out there. It was already documented in magazine articles and newspaper articles, in police reports, homicide reports, organized crime and investigative reports, court transcripts, and the like. So basically, what I was doing was just taking all of that and putting it together into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that was, that's the research that I took. That I never wrote a book that took me less than 4 years. So there was a lot of work that went into these books. But yeah, no real threats, and maybe being a police officer may have had something to do with that. I suppose.
Yeah. Rick, can we go into a little bit about just your drumming in general? I am a music guy. My first instrument I learned was piano. I was in the marching band. I played the trumpet. When I was a teenager, I learned the guitar, and all my good friends played drums, so I kind of learned a little bit through them. So love and respect music. And so what I know, jazz drumming is like the hardest of all the drumming. Like, it's the most difficult. There was that movie Whiplash that kind of depicted what jazz drumming is like and how insanely technical and difficult it can be to pursue that path. So I'm curious to know, like, what that was like coming up as a jazz drummer. I know it ran in the family, so maybe it made it a little bit easier for you, but still, it's not an easy. It's definitely not like, ACDC, just kind of like single beat type stuff. Like, it's
Yeah.
complicated rhythmic type stuff. So I'd love to know a little bit about your drumming side.
Sure. I'm going to start with the comment you made about marching band. That's great. I went to Cleveland Heights High School. They had a great jazz ensemble. I only was in marching band because if you were a percussionist, you had to march to be in the jazz ensemble. And they had a really good jazz ensemble. Some of the guys, they became numerous players became professional musicians, some of whom that I would work with in the years that I came off the road. But yeah, my interest in music is simple. I grew up in a musical family. My father, as I mentioned, was a jazz drummer during the 50s and 60s, and then my brother, who's 9 years older, came along and he became a drummer. So there were always drums up in the house. So probably, and my father's music was jazz. He grew up during the swing era, and you know I mean, my brother, I think he had a little bit wider view of music. We listened to other groups, Earth, Wind, and Fire, and Al Jarreau, and Chicago. Um, but primarily, we were jazz drummers, and big band drumming is kind of a specialty. But jazz in and of itself, any instrument, it's you have to specifically learn how to play jazz. You're interpreting music into a jazz feel, into a swing feel, and especially for drummers because there's so much going on. You're not like you're playing a trumpet. You're playing one horn. You're reading each note. Drummers, there's too much going on. So when you have a big band arrangement in front of you, you have to interpret that music. And that took uh, a few months for me to actually understand that when you had something written, maybe a whole line of quarter notes just across the whole line, that didn't mean to play quarter notes. That meant to play time, and then you'd get into the figures that the band was playing. And but I loved playing with a big band. Now we were, speaking of drums in my family, we were significantly influenced, my brother and I, by the great drummer Louis Bellson, who I think during the 50s or very early 60s, my father became a very good friend of Louis. I think he met him here in Cleveland, and they became pals. And anytime Louis came through Cleveland, my father would pick him up. He'd come over to the house. He'd have dinner. His whole band, even the big band, came one time. So Louis Bellson was a significant influence because we knew him personally, but we were also influenced by the great other great drummers, all the Harold Jones, Joe Jones, all the Jones guys, Buddy Rich, Gene Krupa, all the great players. But Louis, we had a special place in our hearts for him because we knew him personally. So my brother and I developed a style. We developed our styles in the way that Louis played. We kind of aspired to play like him. So I had all that encouragement and that exposure to jazz drumming from when I was 5, 6, 7 years old.
Yeah, that was another thing I loved about your book too, is that how people like Louis Bellson would just come over for dinner. Like your dad was very hospitable to these performers and musicians, and you grew up like just, having them at your house, for the holidays, whatever. And I mean, that's a really cool thing that maybe when you're a kid, you might not realize the significance of it until later in life when you realize like what legends these people were and how close you were to them and how he
Yeah.
helped you get the gig for Sammy Davis Jr. and which I want to get into. Like, what was that like, just being part of the band, part of the entourage? Did you do a lot of touring with Sammy Davis Jr.? I mean, it's a rough lifestyle. You're up late at night. You're probably sleeping during the day. At a young, 19 years old, like what was that transition like going as a teen to like literally like legendary status with Sammy Davis Jr.?
Yeah, well, it started really with with my father and my brother. My brother Ray Perella Jr., again 9 years older, and he was, he had become a professional musician age 16. My father, got him down there and wrote that check to get him his card at the Musicians Union Local 4 here in Cleveland. So he started off when he was 16, and his career was just taking off every year. And you mentioned bands at the house. My brother had a short stint with the Count Basie band. So I knew who these guys were, and my father had them over the house too. My father was a networker before that word became very popular. So the Basie band was there. Now I knew, even at age whatever I was, 10 or 12, running around with a camera because I was a bit of a shutterbug. You've seen a lot of the pictures in the book. The book's pretty much loaded with pictures, many of which I took. I knew who these guys were. So after my brother's stint with the Basie band, Sammy Davis Jr., he at some point in 1985, he needed a drummer. Louis Bellson knew Sammy and was friendly with Sammy and his longtime music director, George Rhodes. And Louis recommended Ray to George Rhodes. And that's how my brother got the job. And he went on the road and traveled with Sammy Davis Jr. as his drummer for almost 6 years. So as you mentioned, David, traveling can be rough. A road musician. Now there were some that in Sammy's group that were there 10, even 20 years. George, I think, was with Sammy close to 30 years. George Rhodes started for a couple of years as a piano player and then became his music conductor way back around 1960, I think it was. So my brother put in the word recommendation for me, and I was just out of high school, 1980. I was into 1981. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and then I get the call in the afternoon. I think it was in January, right after New Year's, January of 1981. It was George Rhodes on the phone, and started talking to him. He said, that he heard I might be interested in taking over for my brother, and And to make a long story short, he basically gave me an audition gig. It was outside of Minneapolis called the Carlton Dinner Theater. And I didn't understand at first that I was going to be playing the gig. I thought, and I asked him, I said, Mr. Rhodes, he's like, call me George, babe. I said, am I going to audition during a rehearsal? You know, they're going to have another like professional veteran drummer who's filling in after my brother left until they get somebody, and then I'll sit in during a rehearsal. And I asked him that. He said, no, babe, you've got the gig for 3 nights. So, you know, sight unseen, unheard, they hired me for 3 nights in Minneapolis. So, of course, I was pretty nervous about that, but I prepped and my father was like, and I think he may have known already. Maybe George called him, I don't know, ahead of time, but he said, let's keep this quiet until we see how you do in Minneapolis, uh, which was good advice in general. But went to Minneapolis, played the rehearsal. During the middle of the rehearsal, Sammy came into the theater, as I would learn in later months. He always did. He came in for a sound check. He'd only be there 10, 15 minutes, maybe a half hour, do a sound check, maybe rehearse a new tune that he was adding in, and then he'd take off. So I saw him. He said, you know, I'm up on the drum riser, and he shook hands with some of the guys. And, you know, the guitar player, Frank Accardo's like, hey, Mr. D, how you doing? Hi, Frank, and this and that. And then I just tried not to pay attention to that. I was looking at the music because, as I would learn, Sammy did not line up his music like 1 through 16 or something like that. There was a pool of music, but we never knew exactly what he was going to do, and he might pull something that wasn't in that pool of music. When I first saw like 20 tunes on a sheet that the trombone player to my left had, I thought it was a lineup, and I would learn that no, Sammy didn't work like that. He set up his first, second, and third tunes, and then that was it. After that, you had to either listen for cues. Of course, you'd always be watching George Rhodes, or Sammy might outright call. He might turn around and say, George, let's do Birth of the Blues. So that was, you know, something that, I don't know, I wasn't checking my blood pressure, but it had to be pretty high at that point. And then to top it off, George decides to do a tune called Every Little Beat Helps. Now, they always featured the band at the beginning of the show. Sammy and George, they always feature the band. These are world-class musicians. There's a string section to my right. The band's on my left. Great players. And that particular arrangement calls for an extended drum solo. And I'm thinking to myself, why are they doing this on my first show? Because there's going to be like an extended drum solo. I'm going to be playing for maybe a minute, 90 seconds, you know, and then I'm going to have to bring the band in. I knew how to do that, you know, but this is my first show. It all went pretty well. You know, and I'm my worst critic. I didn't think I did that great, but I got through it. And after the first rehearsal went okay. And then after the first show, there were 2 shows the first night, pretty sure. And then Sammy called, actually it was George, called musicians. Sammy carried 4 musicians and the conductor. And it was Frank Accardo, the guitarist. Gary Rayner, the bassist, would come in like a month later to replace Al McKibben, and Mickey Laverine, the pianist, and Phip Ricard, his longtime lead trumpeter. So George calls us all back. He says, Sammy wants to see all of us in his dressing room. So I go back there, and he comes up to me, and he said, you're a bitch of a player. And he shook my hand, and yeah, that was something. Gave us red handkerchiefs to sort of commemorate the new boy. They started calling me new boy because I was 18. I wasn't even 19 yet. I was 18, and that's how it all started. And then later, George would tell me they were impressed because when Sammy came in for the sound check during rehearsal, he said, you didn't choke up. He said a lot of players, even veteran guys that have been around, when Sammy comes in, they kind of choke up, and that affects their playing. And I owe my brother for that, my brother Ray for that, because in the 5.5 or 6 years that he worked for Sammy, I had a little bit of exposure. I met Sammy and George at the Front Row Theater. I had seen a couple of the shows. I listened to a couple of recordings that my brother had done with him, the big album that they did at the Sydney Opera House in Australia. I think that was 1978 or 77. Great recording. So I had some exposure to the music, but there were still it was still a big challenge for me. There were tunes I had to occasionally we had to sight read. Unfortunately, I had at least a couple of years, because like my brother, I joined the Musicians Union when I was 16. My father took me down there, paid me the fee. He would for years. He paid our dues every year. It was in a card sitting on the Christmas tree. So every Christmas he would pay for the following year's dues, and that would be a gift, one of his gifts to me and Ray. Yeah, and that's how it all started. And I would remain on the road with Sammy for 2.5 years.
Wow. Yeah, one of the lines in your book I really liked was how you described Sammy's shows. He would say that he wants his shows to feel like a house party. So when you were
Yes,
talking about how he only just has the first couple songs and then from there it's just improvisation, and to be able to keep up with him and to be able to, like you said, know your cues and know where he's going from here. And then jazz drumming, jazz in itself is a lot of improvisation and just kind of going with where the beat takes you. I'm very like fascinated with how difficult all that is and how to just keep it all together and to keep up. I think that's super fascinating and crazy and cool. I want to know what it was like at that young age to be exposed to Las Vegas at that time. Like, what was it like Vegas in the '80s? Your book says he liked to perform at Caesar's
sure.
Palace. You're not even 21 yet. Like, what? Like, were you getting any special privileges in the casinos because of, you were with the Sammy Davis Jr. entourage? Like, what was Vegas like through your eyes at that
Well,
age in that era?
commenting on the first thing you said about the show, and keep in mind he had a longtime musical conductor, George Rhodes, very capable. And then I'm surrounded by these veteran players, mostly in their 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe some in their 60s. These guys and gals have been around for a long time, so they had a lot of experience playing those shows. They had the sight read a tune, but you did have to stay alert for Sammy and listen for cues. Like, for instance, if you started talking about his hometown, you knew that he was going to do New York next, and you'd cue. Like if you were in a city that you didn't go too often, you might cue the players around there. The percussionist is behind me. I might whisper to him. But yeah, so Vegas in general, like my first visit was not when I was on the road with Sammy, but it was a year or two before that as a contestant in a national drum contest. It was actually the Louis Belson Slingerland Drum Company contest that was sponsored by Louis and the drum company, and that my father said, "Hey, you got to be in this contest." Another thing I was kind of nervous about. I was still in high school, and there was, I think, 900 kids, like anywhere from 15 to 18, who competed in this thing. There were local competitions. Mine was in Erie, Pennsylvania. Then there was I won that and was able to move to the regionals. We're at the Capital University in Columbus, Ohio, and then won that. And then, a smaller group of us from all over the country went to the semifinals and finals, which were in Las Vegas at the UNLV, is it the University of Nevada in Las Vegas? And it was, we see the MC was Wayne Newton, and Louis' big band was there. And part of the competition was that you had to, I think for the four finalists, was that you had to perform with Louis' band. Now that was a prize in and of itself for me because I grew up listening to that big band, Louis' big band in small groups. So that was a real special thing for me. And eventually, they narrowed it down to four semifinals, and I placed number 4 in the contest. That was 1980. The winner was a kid named Hank Gualianon from, I think it was Rolling Meadows, Illinois. But when I first got there, my father rented a car. We're driving around. I had some cousins that were there, came in from Los Angeles. And one of the things I remember were the lights at night, like going downtown. Is it Fremont Street?
Mhm.
Like that's the
Yep.
main, and then on the strip. So it's nighttime. It's getting dark pretty soon. It's nighttime, but the lights downtown and on the strip, they're making it like daylight. And for me, it was almost I don't know. It was so weird. It was like supernatural, like cosmic, because it's nighttime, but it's like the opposite, like if you've experienced a solar eclipse where it's daytime and all of a sudden there, after a few minutes it gets dark and it's like nighttime. It could be 2 in the afternoon. A really weird feeling that like that. I remember that in all of the traffic and the we went to see a jazz group. I'm trying to remember the name of the group. Jack Sheldon, who had been the music director for the old Merv Griffin show, he was there with some great players. Drummer Nick Ceroli, who from Ohio, and it was at this club, this little jazz club called the Hofbrauhaus. I'm pretty sure that was the name. And so I'm getting to experience that, and nobody's really bothering me too much. And maybe I don't know, I probably was just drinking a 7-Up, but yeah, it was just a little surreal for me because Las Vegas is so, the casinos with the noises and the lights and the flashing and the chinging of these machines. It really made quite an impression. So and we were there for a few nights. So I already had an idea of what Las Vegas was like. But even just arriving there, like at the airport, I remember they had I don't know if they still have it or not, but they had because I'm talking about 1980 and then 81. When you got off the plane, you went through there. There were slot machines everywhere. It's like this is the airport. They had slot machines, and people are playing the slot machines. And then when we start heading toward, to exit the airport, there's a people mover, and you got on, and then there's these overhead recorded voices that are celebrities, and I don't remember specifically who they were. It could have been Dean Martin saying, "This is Dean Martin. Welcome to Las Vegas. Please stand to the right and pass to the left." And all these little details are making quite an impression on this first 16-year-old kid, and then a year and a half, 2 years later, this 18-year-old. So it's quite a brilliant, dazzling sort of experience for me as I started off. Yeah.
Rick, that's so fascinating because you're talking about 1980 and it's still like that today. And that was one of my questions was, were there slot machines in the airport back then? And what you described
I
about the
think there
celebrities on
were.
like intercom,
Yeah,
like,
I'm pretty sure I remember that
wow.
from back then, not from later. Because I did not return. Well, I did a couple times, probably in the 80s, maybe in the 90s when my brother was there. But I have not been back to Vegas for, several decades. It's just, I've settled here. I had my law enforcement career here, and we didn't really do a whole lot of traveling. We had our children, and so I hadn't been back there. So those are memories from when I was there, 80 and
Yeah.
79, 80, 81, and then through 83 or through July of 83 when I left the show.
Yeah. Did you ever encounter the Rat Pack, that era, or did you ever get to meet those guys, Dean Martins, Frank Sinatra? Uh, any experiences with that since Sammy Davis Jr. was part of the Rat Pack and all that?
Yeah, he was really a core member in that group. They just, I don't know, they kind of defined Las Vegas, cocktail in one hand, cigarette in the other, and all the movies they made back, what was that, the 60s maybe, Robin and the Seven Hoods and Ocean's 11 and all that. So there was only a couple times that I remember seeing either one of them. One of them was in 1983. Frank Sinatra invited Sammy and Dean to be part of a benefit for, I think it was the Palm Desert Hospital in Palm Springs. And we were there, and it was pretty much a Rat Pack show. And there were major celebrities and political figures there. And it wasn't, Sammy, of course, didn't do a whole show. He did a few tunes. They brought in these great players from LA. I remember Conti Condoli was one of them from The Tonight Show, Doc Severinsen's show, the Johnny Carson show. And these great players were, they were the band for Frank, Sammy, and Dean, and they were together. But during the rehearsal, I remember taking a picture, or before rehearsal when they were getting set up. I took a picture of the three of them together, and then later during the rehearsal, I think George had called a break. I was still up at the drum set, maybe making some adjustments or looking at music, and Frank Sinatra came out onto the stage, and he walked over to George, who was also looking at his music at his podium, George Rhodes, Sammy's conductor. And they hugged and they're, chatting for a while. I was looking at my music, and then all of a sudden I heard George say, "Have you met our drummer, Ricky Porello?" And I looked up, and Frank just, because I'm up on the drum riser and he's down by the conductor's podium. He just waved to me, and I'm like, "Hello, Mr. Sinatra." So that was the closest I came to meeting Frank Sinatra, or seeing the Rat Pack together. There was one more time, an unfortunate benefit that Sammy, I think, decided to do in Atlanta. There was a serial killer roaming around and killing like young black kids. It was really bad situation. And the investigation, they needed money for the investigation. Sammy jumped in there, as he often did for these causes. He was very generous with his time and money. So they put together the show, and Frank was on that show, and I forget who else was there, but there was another time that Frank Sinatra was on one of the shows that Sammy was doing, or vice versa. Yeah.
Wow. Rick, we're going to wrap up in a little bit, but before we do, producer Paul behind the scenes, by the way, shout out. He's making us look good. He's got a few questions, and so I want him to jump in.
So Rick, thanks again for being here. Such great things that you're telling us. Really interesting. One of the things I was wondering was you mentioned your father was like a networker. You were talking a little bit about that. And I was thinking, wow, you're in law enforcement, you're a writer, you're a musician. These are all industries where you are like in people's lives. They bring you into their listening, into reading, and then if we all come across law enforcement agents. Did you always want to be in people's lives, or did life just take you there through your decisions? Based on what you're telling us with your pop. Again, networking seems to be part of that.
Yeah, well, I always loved music. When I was a kid, there was always jazz playing, and the drums were around. I was playing and learning, and then started taking lessons probably when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old. But so music was always a big part of my life. And then my brothers, starting to play with some celebrities, and then my father's having these musicians and these bands over, Maynard Ferguson, the Count Basie band, Louis Belson's band. So I'm exposed to all that. But there was also a seed planted that, and I talk about that in the book. We don't need to get into that, of how my interest in police work started. And then my curiosity about my grandfather. I think that would come together in a beneficial way, because I was learning to write and interview people, try to get information from them as a writer, writing about history, organized crime history. So in police work, you're doing the same thing. You're investigating cases. Maybe not I'm not talking about the detective bureau who's handling, the most serious cases, but you're still, as a patrol officer, you're investigating cases. So you're learning to get information from people. You're learning to kind of make them comfortable. So I think what happened for me, I think being a writer helped me as a police officer, but being a police officer also helped me as a writer. Different styles involved, but I think that all came together to improve my writing, and I think I'm really still working on that. It's kind of a work in progress.
Thanks for that. The one thing that stood out when you were talking about players who met Sammy, they get choked up. So on some level, I'm thinking, wow, so he's 18 and he's meeting Sammy Davis, all this. And I'm thinking about how I was at 18. David, I don't know how you felt, but I was like, where does this confidence come from? Even as your life progresses and you go into these areas of law enforcement and writing in general, anybody who's out there putting something into the world, especially nowadays, is going to face some level of negativity. While it shouldn't be something that stops us, I'm wondering, at 18, back in a time when obviously social media wasn't existing and things like that, where did that confidence come from, and where did it morph as you continue to go on? Clearly,
yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that. There are people that have a lot of confidence, and then there's people that don't have a lot of confidence. And you got to be careful when you have confidence, because you want to make sure it doesn't border on cockiness. Confidence is a great thing to have. I didn't have a whole lot of confidence. I was starting off, but I think what makes the difference, whether you're playing drums for a major entertainer, stepping on stage for the first time, or writing your first book, or putting on a police uniform and finishing up with your training officer, and now you're out there solo at 2 a.m. making traffic stops, maybe by yourself. Um, Confidence and fear. You might not have confidence, you may have fear, but I think the difference is you recognize it and you keep moving. If you're a writer, and it can be fearful to write, to write things, because you're going to be putting that baby out to the world. Uh, you got to write in spite of that fear. You got to write in spite of your lack of confidence that you're doing a good job. You can learn to write as you move along. You can get an editor. You can proofread. You could do all those things as a drummer. Heck yeah, I was nervous when out of the corner of my eye I see Sammy walk in to that theater, but I had a little bit of experience already, and I knew that I had to just concentrate on the music. And again, I credit my brother Ray for having exposed me to that a little bit already. That made a difference too. But I think the difference is you work past that. That's the difference, like between a working writer and a writer who has started but just can't seem to finish because they don't have the confidence, or they're fearful of finishing that book, screenplay, whatever it is, and then presenting it to the world. The difference is you keep working. You're a working writer. You just keep doing it, and sometimes you have setbacks, and certainly police officers, you could have fear, and you got to act like you don't have fear. You can't show someone that you're afraid, and there's certainly other fields where that could apply too. You just have to get out there, and you have to be confident of your abilities, your ability to talk to other people, to de-escalate situations. But of course, we're talking about police work. That's a whole other thing than a whole different thing than writing or playing music. That's on a different level. But I think some of those things about dealing with fear and confidence still apply.
Great, thank you very much. Back to you, David.
Great questions, Paul, man. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, can you just tell everyone where they can get your book, your latest book, along with your previous books, and where to best find you?
Yeah, well, my daughter has gotten me involved with social media a little bit more, with Instagram and forget the other one. I'm really not too I don't do too well with yet, but I've been on Facebook for quite a while. Rick Perello author, I think, is my handle or whatever, but I'm pretty easy to find otherwise. I have a website, rickperello.com, and the books are available really any bookstore. I always tell people, I suggest that they patronize their local bookstores, especially the independents. Go there and buy the book. But if you're online, I'm in all of the online stores, and even if that independent store doesn't have it, they're probably not going to have it in stock. They can order it. They can order it and get it, and some of them even deliver. They'll even ship out the copies. But any bookstore should be able to order the books in any of the online stores.
Okay, awesome. And Rick, one final question, just as a wrap up to the entire show. Which, by the way, thanks so much for being here. I really just want to kind of close this out on what are some nuggets of wisdom, some takeaways from performing with Sammy Davis Jr., whether it be some one-on-one moments that you might have gotten to have with him. Like, did he ever instill any life lessons, wisdom, whether it be in conversation with him and you personally, or maybe just by working with him and observing him? What sort of life wisdom takeaways that maybe you can apply, or you did apply to your life all the way back then?
Yeah, well, Sammy is an entertainment icon, and I wouldn't even say an American treasure. He's an international treasure because the audiences across the world loved him. That's a whole subject in and of itself, and there's some great books out there. There's autobiographies like Why Me, that was published in the 80s, a couple of years before, or I'm sorry, in the 90s, before Sammy, or no, the 80s, yeah, before he died in 1990, and some other biographies that were published in the 2000s. I would encourage anyone to read those books, because I learned a lot about him that I didn't really know working with him. But working with him, you're a musician. Really, no matter what you do, you got to practice. You got to be committed. I have sort of consulted with wannabe writers and upcoming authors working on their first book. And one of the first words, the big C word, is commitment. You have to be committed to the project that you're working on. If you're a musician, you have to be committed to learning that instrument, learning how to read music, and learning command of that instrument, so that the ideas in your head flow effortlessly through your fingers and into that and through that instrument. Being where you need to be on time is a big one. That was like the number one thing. I had to be at that show, in that dressing room, maybe 45 minutes or an hour before. I had to be on that drum riser 10 minutes before that show started, and that was never an issue. I had to stay alert. That was a problem one time where I wasn't alert, and I talk about that in the book, and started to play the wrong tune that George Rhodes was dropping that downbeat on, and it only lasted for 3 or 4 beats before I recovered. But staying alert, practicing and learning your craft, whatever that might be, whatever you decide to do in life. And I think basically, having good, this is an important one, especially in police work, is having good interpersonal communication skills, especially nowadays with these cell phones. We're buried in them. They have our attention because we could pull up anything we want, especially with young people. You have to learn to talk with other people face to face. And again, probably within the realm of interpersonal communications, one important thing, and that is a skill that doesn't seem to be very popular anymore. You're doing it right now. Paul's doing it right now. And that's called listening. Listening just seems to go out of style. Even on social media, it seems like everybody wants to talk. Everybody wants to post. And not as many people want to listen or read. So, you got to learn to listen and develop those skills, because across the board, in probably 90% of the things that somebody might do for a career, interpersonal communication is going to be a really important part of that. Maybe not absolutely everything. You might work behind the scenes, but that's such an important part of what we do, interacting with one another.
Very well said, Rick. I want to thank you again. And before we go, I want to let people who are listening know that we have some signed copies of Rick's newest book. Whoop, this way. This is his latest one right here. No, sorry, we're reversed.
There you go.
This is his latest book, signed copy, and this is one of his previous books about the Cleveland Mafia. And so just leave us a comment on YouTube telling us your favorite part about this conversation, and I'll send you a copy of these books. And so with that said, Rick, thank you again for being one of the Vegas Faces, and I hope we get to do this again sometime down the road.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Paul. Yeah.
Thank you for subscribing to Vegas Faces on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok under the name Gavri Group. That's Gavri Group. Thanks, everybody. See you at the next episode.